What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic channel. And today we're talking some college football DFS ahead of week 7, the main slate. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. If you've done that, thank you very much. It helps us a ton at the channel, and I really appreciate it. So thanks again, and thank you if you've already done that. We are sponsored by Prize Picks. They have a first match deposit bonus up to $100 when you click the link in the video description below. And they're giving you 1 free month of Odd Shopper. We have tons of tools on Odd Shopper to help you with all sorts of sports betting, including player props, which is something you can exploit over at Prize Picks. We have college football, but there's also tools for NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB still going on, and any of the niche sports that you can take advantage of. So make sure to check them out. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, please call or text 1-800-GAMBLER. You must be 21 or older to play. All right, let's dive into the main slate. Couple fun games. Kicking off with a blowout. Georgia takes on Vanderbilt. 31.5 point spread, 56 total. Georgia's been putting a spanking on some teams recently. Most recently dismantled Kentucky. They're slow, but they're pass heavy, actually. 52.5% pass, and they're living through efficiency. That's just what's going to happen with Georgia. Carson Beck. I think he's live for a 300-yard bonus, as he's averaged this year, 316 yards through the air. Gives you a little mobility, not a ton, 51 cumulative yards. The main thing there is he's not really going to take sacks, so he's not going to get you negative points. But Beck's always live in contrarian stacks, especially with Georgia implied for nearly 44 points. Not going to be among the top price-adjusted options, but still a good tournament stacking option nonetheless. Running back, this was the fear with Georgia last week. In competitive games, they've been a timeshare for years, like 5+ years. They kind of had to use Dewan Edwards as a lead back because Kendall Milton was injured. Kendall Milton actually led this team in yards last year. Now he's back from injury. First thing we saw, Dewan Edwards 9 carries, Milton 8. This is pretty likely to be a 50-50 timeshare, which means Edwards is too expensive and Milton comes in as an average price-adjusted play. Georgia backs always have immense upside, but in a game against Vandy, you probably see this rotation expanded to include players like Andrew Paul and Cash Jones. So kind of difficult to get to. The receivers, it's sort of Brock Bowers or pass. He's the only player that has a locked-in route share. Even when you look at Dominic Lovett, and we recently saw Ladd McConkey return, these players do not participate in even 50% of the routes sometimes. So it's pretty difficult to get to those guys when they're expensive. Ra Thomas would be my favorite if you force me to pick one. And that just comes down to the route share he has. It's been a little bit better than those other two guys. But with that said, I don't think it's going to consistently be – the last 2 games, it's been at 70%. I think at any point in time, you could see Dominic Lovett, Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, Dylan Bell, Arian Smith, or Ladd McConkey pop up for a larger route share. So it's pretty dicey outside Bowers. Bowers, I think, is entirely fine, even at the elevated price. Vandy starting Ken Seals. What a nightmare matchup for the kid. They came out and said they hope he can play well enough to retain the starting job. What are the expectations for Ken Seals in this matchup? I don't know. You're not playing Ken Seals, even at 53. This backfield, it's going to be interesting in future weeks because they're finally giving the freshman Cedric Alexander more work. But do we want to play him against Georgia? I mean, he's 4,100. So there's a certain cheap back I'd rather play than Cedric Alexander, but I at least need to say his name because he's emerging. These receivers for Vandy are interesting. You can maybe take a flyer on a cheap PPR-based play, maybe as a run back. In order, they would be Will Shepherd, Jaden McGowan, and Quincy Skinner, who's now back from injury. I don't love any of these guys. I'm not going to lie to you. Tight end is a rotation. I just think you're dealing with a lot of opportunity cost at a position where there's some pretty good studs. Game 2, Indiana takes on Michigan. A similar game environment, a sort of name your score type game. 33-point spread in favor of Michigan. Indiana, well, their implied team total is at 6.25 points, and that's because the game total is only at 45.5, and Michigan is a 33-point favorite. X out Indiana. I don't think we need to waste time on that. Josh Henderson might be back after the bye. That would render this a 3-way committee. They've already benched Taven Jackson in game for Brennan Sorsby. That could happen at any point in time. Cam Camper is back, which muddles the receiver rotation. Donovan McCulley, Omar Cooper, DeCoos Carter. I don't know what the route share looks like now that Cam Camper's back. Pretty easy fade. To the Michigan side we go. This team has not played a competent team all year, and they don't until November. So it's very hard to decipher what they're going to do in matchups like this. They definitely take their foot off the gas, as they did last week. Blake Corum, 9 carries. Donovan Edwards, 4. Khalil Mullings at 8. Then you see the whole cast of 4-star freshman backs getting in for a carry here and there. Corum and Edwards have elite upside. It's just, does Indiana keep this close enough where they start pressing towards the ceiling volume-wise, or are they forced to get there on efficiency? Edwards is a better price-adjusted play, but he's also had a much more volatile workload. I think it's still tough to play the Michigan backs. There's far better options. I would say they're GPP or bust. JJ McCarthy, same thing. He's averaging 215 yards per game. Only 21 attempts. I mean, if Indiana pushes him towards 30, he would be an awesome play. We just don't have any confidence that that occurs. Pass game, we've seen the upside with Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson this year. Neither of them have eclipsed 5 targets in the last 4 games. Colston Loveland is actually the only player who has, and that occurred on one instance where he had 6 targets. Nobody has seen more than that in an individual game, going back 4 games. So it's the same thing with Michigan. If you want to be a little contrarian, they have a massive team total, just more of a blowout even than the Georgia game. Ohio State, Purdue, finally we get to a spot that's not quite as heavy in favor of a blowout in Ohio State's favor. 19-point spread, favor of the Buckeyes, 50.5 total. Purdue's a pretty willing dance partner here. What they lack in efficiency, they play pretty fast, 40th in pace, 50.5% pass rate. Ohio State's been very pass heavy at 52%, about average in pace. McCord's averaging 275 yards per game. His efficiency metrics are poor. And this still isn't, a Notre Dame or something on the other side that's really going to push him towards 30 attempts. I think you're probably going to see him sit right in that 25 range. And with that, his ceiling is just not as high as some of the other signal callers. He's priced a little bit better. So, you're still looking at a 300-yard bonus or a bust because he doesn't run. He's a little tricky to play. The backfield, Trevion Henderson is back. I think he comes right back and gets a full workload. Chip Trayanum, the guy that handled 20 carries last week. I'm sorry if you played Chip Trayanum. He had one of the worst games I've ever seen. It was like 20 carries for 60 yards or something atrocious. Just a horrific showing from Trayanum. Mayan Williams has been iced. Trevion Henderson had a lead back role prior to his injury. I don't know what it looks like here. They still have used 3 backs. Even with a majority of the work in the last couple games, Henderson only saw 14 and 15 touches. So at 7K, it's a bit pricey for a running back that's in a timeshare. Receiver, the big news to monitor is Emeka Egbuka. Left their last game, didn't even make it through 50% of the snaps before the injury occurred. There's been no update on his status. They said he'll try to go. He's day-to-day. It doesn't sound optimistic, and this is a good game to sit Egbuka. Purdue's not really live to win this game. So I don't know. You're going to have to watch. Marvin Harrison, he's always going to be an elite contrarian play. The volume's good, 9.2 targets per game. He's averaging 100 yards. You just have to pay for him at 85. There's no discount on Marvin Harrison. To me, he is a contrarian one-off to use situationally. Beyond this, if Egbuka is out, that's where we start getting really interesting. Julian Fleming at 5,800. He should become the wide receiver 2. He's averaging 4.2 targets per game. And then I think it's Xavier Johnson who would be the 3. I think my data is actually misreading Xavier Johnson. There's a lot of guys with this name, so I think he's listed as a receiver on DraftKings. This just could be an error in my software in the back end. I'll search him quick, and then I'll fix this if it's actually the case. Yeah, he's listed at receiver. He's actually 4,600, so I'll correct this quickly. But anyway, I think he probably operates as the wide receiver 3 here. The only thing is maybe you see like a Carnell Tate or something emerge. They're 5-star freshman. Johnson had 30% of the routes immediately after the injury, so I think he's interesting as a very cheap play. Finally, Cade Stover at tight end. He has 18 targets over the last 3 games. That's pretty good, and he's averaging 61 yards, so Stover has actually been pretty efficient. Just the last thing to mention, excuse me on the Xavier Johnson, sometimes just these naming conventions get a little mixed up when guys have really, really basic names like Xavier does. Purdue, 15.75 implied team total. Hudson Card, not efficient at all. 36 attempts per game. He's only been able to achieve 248 yards through the air in this offense. 35 rushing yards, so he's not really giving you negative yards consistently. But it's a tough matchup for sure. Ohio State's strength of their team is defense this year, and their pass defense has been phenomenal. Card's really cheap, so he's actually in the price range where I'm tempted to consider him, but I think there's players with higher upside in future games. Unfortunately, we just got 3 blowouts right out of the gate. Backfield, Devin Maccabee should handle a monster workload. Tyrone Tracy's doubtful. Dylan Downing is a change of pace. When Tracy went down, they immediately fed Devin Maccabee 20 inefficient carries and gave him almost every single route. So even if the game is out of hand, Devin Maccabee's on the field catching passes in negative game script. 5,200, not the worst play, not the best either. He's going to be a middling price adjusted guy. And then similar to Vandy, on the Purdue side, because they're so pass heavy, you have some PPR value for a few of the pass catchers. Deion Burks, Abdur-Rahman Yassin, and TJ Sheffield are on the field every single snap. Then you had Max Clare get injured, so the tight end they've used instead is Garrett Miller. No price discount on Miller. He's coming off an 8-target game, 4,100. They're all a little overpriced. A little. If you're running an Ohio State stack, I'd look for a run back. But these aren't going to be preferred plays. Syracuse, Florida State, 17.5-point spread. Eventually, we'll get to a spread that's not 3 scores, and it's not going to be in the next 2 games. 54.5 total in favor, 17.5-point spread in favor of Florida State, 54.5 total. Syracuse is fast. They're 22nd in pace with a 47.5% pass rate. Since Syracuse ended their incredibly easy non-con, they've melted, and Garrett Schrader has melted with them. Only averaging 212 passing yards per game on 26 attempts. Garrett Schrader makes his money running. That's been the case throughout his career, going all the way back to Mississippi State. He has 368 rushing yards this year. Tough matchup against Florida State. We've seen him struggle and not pay off in recent weeks in tougher matchups. I'm worried that's the case here in the mid-7s. The backfield, LaQuint Allen, 11 carries, 3 targets. I mean, he has a pretty good workload even when they're getting crushed. So at 6,100, he's starting to get a little expensive. Last week, he was below 6K, just a middling price adjusted option. And they got killed last week. So you saw Juwan Price play a little bit. Like, they need just to not absolutely get slaughtered. And LaQuint Allen probably gets 17 to 20 touches. Last week, it was just so far out of hand that at some point, they just benched guys. In the receiving room, Isaiah Jones did return. He only played a handful of snaps, but I'm worried about him playing more. Without him, it's been pretty condensed in terms of their wide receivers. It starts with Donovan. I think he's the first guy you look at. Donovan Brown, that is. Over 90% of the routes in 3 of the last 4. Then I would say it's Umari Hatcher and Damian Alford. Their routes have been a little inconsistent. Hatcher went 97%, 51%, 96. Alford went 97, 88, 40. So you can see that there's a little inconsistency with the wide receiver 2-3. But I would play both these guys over Darrell Gill, who I think is the wide receiver 4. 46% of routes and 48. They used Dan Villari a ton last week, which was a surprise. Up to 84% of the routes from 51% the week prior. Villari maybe is interesting as a GPP play, but even he at 3,600, you wish you were getting a little bit more of a discount in a situation where he hasn't consistently played all the routes. Florida State, this team is excellent for tournaments, spread close enough where Syracuse should push them. Jordan Travis, I don't quite put him in the Jaden Daniels category, but he has good dual threat ability, and he's hyper efficient as a passer. He's already exited a game with an injury, so his stats are a little depressed. And they haven't often had a willing dance partner. Everyone saw the LSU game, but they played Boston College in a weather game, had a couple other blowouts. This game is at least close enough where Travis could be pushed towards the ceiling, which I think is noteworthy. 9K is expensive for him, but he does project well. Love playing guys like Travis in tournaments. The backfield's a 3-way committee. Trey Benson leads it. Toafili catches passes out of the backfield, and Rodney Hill's a change of pace. They're all a little too expensive for my liking. The receiving game, Johnny Wilson's questionable after he exited their last game with an injury. That would put Keon Coleman in the driver's seat to just see a monster target share. He's already averaging 55.5 yards per game, and he left the game too with an injury, so I think these stats are a little depressed. The question is, what does Florida State do outside of Keon Coleman in this situation? They've returned some guys from injury. Kentron Poitier's back after, he was banged up. Destin Hill's been involved. His routes were at 55% last game. Ja'Kai Douglas was banged up for a bit of time. He jumped up for 31% of the routes. All this to say, it's been a pretty nasty rotation at receiver behind Johnny Wilson and behind Keon Coleman. I think they're all really hard to play. And then the other thing that's really hard, Jaheim Bell, no announcement of this. The guy only played a handful of snaps last week. Norvell came right out after the game and said, yeah, Jaheim Bell was hurt, and we only had a couple packages for him. They haven't updated him, and I don't know how healthy he is coming off the injured game last week. He's 4,100, so, you want to play him, especially on DraftKings, but he didn't even see a target. Can you trust Jaheim Bell right now? I think I would rather play Kyle Morlock. This team has a lot of 12 personnel packages. Morlock might just be more involved because of the injury to Jaheim Bell. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very difficult situation to parse. Honestly, Keon Coleman's just your safe option. Play Coleman and move on. But I generally like Florida State. I'm going to have some Travis Keon Coleman stacks, but that honestly might be it. Maybe rogue Trey Benson in a really contrarian lineup, but even that's a little dicey. Arkansas, Bama, the last one of these massive spreads until we get into some more competitive games. 19.5 points in favor of Bama, 46.5 total. Bama still implied for 33 points. So don't sleep on this team. The team total is very high. Arkansas is kind of getting close to disaster range. 98th in pace, 46% pass rate. KJ Jefferson is having a bad year, and I don't think it's his fault. It is gross negligence what this coaching staff did to KJ Jefferson along the offensive line this offseason. Let 3 guys walk, basically did not do anything to replace them, and it's showing. They're allowing 4.5 sacks per game against one of the best pass rushes in the country. This could be catastrophically bad for KJ Jefferson. He's 7,700. He's not in my player pool. Raheem Sanders at 5,700. I keep wanting to play this guy. He's just not healthy enough. 11 carries and 8 carries. They've been getting slaughtered so badly too that it's not just he's coming off an injury. They can't stay competitive enough in games for them to play from ahead and use a positive game script. Raheem Sanders has been playing a lot in the pass game. He had 4 targets in the last contest, which keeps him at least in the conversation. But I've been artificially boosting him in my player pool. No longer will that occur. Receiving game, Andrew Armstrong and Isaac Tesla. They're your very clear top 2 options. They never leave the field. Armstrong coming off a 9-target game. Tesla coming off a 7-target game. I think Tesla's a good value. He'll project well, and I think if you use an optimizer, you'll get a decent amount of him just as a value play. Once you get beyond that, Tyrone Broden, he's about a 60% route share player. It's up from his 49% on the year. And then Jaden Wilson's been your situational wide receiver 4. Luke Haas is out. I thought they were going to move to Varkey's Gums, their transfer, who actually has just been a bust for them. Instead, they gave almost every single route to Ty Washington, 7 targets. But, DraftKings was asleep at the wheel last week with pricing Tez Walker at the min and then the LSU debacle. Asleep no longer. They did their due diligence. First game, 80% of the rounds, 7 targets, boom, 4,300. No discount on Ty Washington. Playable, but not the value I thought he was going to be. Bama. Jalen Milroe needs some credit for his efficiency. The guy's averaging 232 yards per game, which doesn't look great, but he is only throwing the ball 22 times a game. He is elite rushing. There was a game he was benched, so this 158, adjust for games played, it looks a little better. And his yards per carry is awesome. Designed attempts have been all over the map for Milroe. It kind of depends on how competitive they are in games, but only 1 design attempt last week. This is alarming. Milroe still projects as a decent value, and I'm going to play him. The hard part for me is, do I stack Milroe? Do I leave him alone? And generally, I've been leaning towards non-stacks. But, then you go and you look at the targets, and you see 12 for Jermaine Burton, 9 for Isaiah Bond last week. And it kind of makes you want to stack him. The problem is these guys are expensive. Their route shares still aren't great. I'll pull them up for you guys. So many teams, takes me a while to get to them. All right, so last week, Bond, 62%, Burton, 69%. But generally speaking, that's not great at these prices for a run-heavy team. You've got Amari Niblack. He was at 74% of the routes. That's actually pretty good. And he had 4 targets himself. Niblack is my favorite value play, but I just don't feel strongly about playing any of the Alabama guys. The wide receiver 3 they've been using is Malik Benson. His target share is just terrible. He actually has 9 targets on the year. Rough for the JUCO transfer. But I think they're used situationally. Maybe you mix and match for tournaments. The backfield, Jason McClellan still handles about 70%. Roydell Williams coming in around 30%. McClellan's a decent price adjusted play, 6,300. Arkansas matchup definitely works in his favor. They're 19.5 point favorites. I like McClellan for maybe the first time this year. All right, now we get going. At least tighter spreads. Iowa State, Cincinnati, 5-point spread in favor of the Bearcats. 44.5 total, not great, but I think we could maybe use some guys. Rocco Becht has actually played well recently. If you look at his stats, he's kind of ascending as a player. I still don't know if it's worthwhile. 101st in pace, 53% pass rate, only averaging 204 yards per game. Doesn't run a ton, but he's not giving you negative yards either. He's in this like Hudson Card greasy territory where maybe you use just a punt quarterback in order to jam the Oregon-Washington game, but you don't feel good about it. So I kind of view him and Hudson Card similarly. It's a 4-back committee led by Eli Sanders, followed up by Cartevious Norton, Abu Sama, and even Carson Hansen's getting like 2 carries a game or something. Not relevant, but it hurts the other guys ahead of him. They're projected to be underdogs here, which isn't a great matchup for any of them. Receivers, you can play these guys. They're cheap and they're somewhat useful. Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins are your top 2. I try to find a way to Noel if you can. He's averaging 9.4 targets per game. Higgins comes in at 5.4. Bren Brahmer, their tight end, has been somewhat involved, but his routes are streaky, which is tricky to evaluate. I pulled up the routes for Brahmer. 79%, 38%, 55%, 54%. I think just mean projection is going to put him around 50. Doesn't make him a great price adjusted play, but he's averaging 4 targets per game and he's 3,200. You could do worse. You could definitely do worse. Otherwise, wide receiver 3 is pretty gnarly rotation. Dan Jackson, Dimitri Stanley. Sometimes they use 12 personnel. So behind Noel and Higgins, it's pretty gross. Cincinnati, I like Emory Jones a good amount in this matchup. Iowa State's defense has been solid against the pass, but somewhat giving against the run, allowing over 4 yards per attempt. That's where Emory Jones makes his money. 280 yards on the ground so far this year. And Cincinnati is playing fast. They have a 51%, they're 51st in pace. So Jones does have pretty good volume through the air at 32 attempts per game, even though they're only passing 45.5% of the time. Like Jones, I hesitate to say he's cash viable, but it's somewhat close. The backfield, Ryan Montgomery's injured. We don't know if he returns. You don't get good injury reporting out of Cincinnati, but without him, Miles Montgomery, 12 carries. He had been a non-factor prior to that. Anyway, Corey Kiner has a pretty good role. He should work as the 1A, and then one of the Montgomerys or both will work as change of pace backs. Kiner at 5,200 does make some sense. He's also dominating routes, over 40% on the year. He has 7 targets in the last 2 games. That's combined 3 and 4 targets to be exact. The receiving room is pretty straightforward. Xavier Henderson, 8.4 targets per game. Braden Smith, 5.6. D. Wiggins, 5.2. Those are your top 3 guys. Braden Smith and D. Wiggins are 2 of my favorite value plays on the slate. Game environment's not good, but this is an offense that's going to play with pace, and they don't rotate receivers a lot, so you don't have to worry about this. The situational wide receiver 4 is a rotation between guys like Aaron Turner and Evan Prater, former quarterback. Tight end is also a rotation. We've recently seen Chamon Mateer play a little bit more. He went from 63% of the routes to 74%. If you wanted to throw a dart on an ascending route share, you could, but he's so close in price to Braden Smith and Wiggins, I'd rather just find the salary to get to those guys. I like the Cincinnati team because of pricing and a somewhat competitive game. You're not worried about the blowouts. You just worry about the overall stackability of the game and the ceiling potential. Cal, Utah, a similar game environment, 44.5 point total, 11 point spread in favor of Utah. Again, DraftKings, they've got their fingers on the pulse of the slate. Fernando Mendoza started for Cal, their true freshman. Looked pretty good out there. He has a good yards per carry, finished with only 38 rushing yards, but the guy can run a little bit. And then passing-wise, he looked decent. So normally in a game where you have a guy, new quarterback, cheap quarterback, Cal's 12th in pace, 47% pass rate, and I have a lot of interest in Mendoza, but he's going against Utah, who plays sort of like a fancy armed force academy right now. They pass a lot more than that, but you get what I'm saying. They're 120th in pace. They slow the game. They want to run. 40.5% pass rate for them. Nate Johnson's their signal caller. I have no idea when we see Cam Rising. I'll believe it when I see it at this point. So what Utah has been doing is trying to lean on a mediocre defense and just slow these opponents into volatile games, and it's worked for the most part, which makes me a little weary of Fernando Mendoza. Jaden Ott, he comes off a 29 carry game and he goes down to 13. That game was pretty competitive last week. It wasn't like a complete slaughtering. So I'm wondering if Isaiah Ifans is playing more than we'd like. Makes Jaden Ott somewhat risky at 8,200. Where I do like going is the pass catchers, and I'm fine with one-offs here. Because you have Mendoza under center, like Sam Jackson's just a runner. Ben Finley's just not an NCAA quarterback, like maybe at the FCS level, but not at an FBS level. This is actually like a legitimate quarterback talent finally under center. So Jeremiah Hunter's cheap. His route rate's been 195. Taj Davis, first game back from the injury, he was at 71%. Davis is at 4,300. He saw 8 targets. Jack Endries, their tight end, 7 targets. His route rate was at 83%. These Cal value plays are pretty strong. Even Tron Grizel, he saw his routes cut with Taj Davis back. It's around 50% mark. But 4 targets still. I would rather play Taj Davis and Jack Endries. But man, Jeremiah Hunter is a good value play. He's seeing 8.5 targets per game. Utah probably limits this team, and I don't know if you want to fully stack them, but one-offs from Cal do make some sense in my opinion. Nate Johnson's terrible. He's not even averaging 100 passing yards per game, X amount. The backfield is interesting. Jalen Glover has been playing as the lead back because Jaquindon Jackson got injured. I don't know if Jackson's back. I used to think the Utah beat reporter was bad. I now just think Utah is a steel trap for information. I feel bad for that guy trying to access information from Utah because they've kept the clamps on Rising. They've kept the clamps on Brant Keithy. And you're not going to know if Jaquindon Jackson's playing till warmups. That's just the way it is. If he's out, Jalen Glover's the best price-adjusted running back on the slate. If he's in, Jaquindon Jackson might be that because he's played well ahead of Glover this year. It's just that he's been dealing with an injury since the preseason, so we haven't seen the full Jaquindon Jackson experience. Definitely a late news situation to monitor. Because Nate Johnson is incompetent, the receivers are not playable for Utah. Sorry, it's just the way it is. Oregon-Washington, the game of the week. 66.5 total 3-point spread in favor of Washington. Unlike last week's debacle with LSU, they actually priced this game really well, and it makes stacking the game impossible and stacking the teams pretty difficult. We'll start with Oregon. They're the underdog. 77th in pace, 54% pass rate. Bo Nix is at 10K. This is an appropriate price. He's very difficult to play on the context of this slate, but he's still a good play based on his upside. Really good efficiency from Nix, and he has a lot of rushing we haven't seen this year because they have only played one good opponent, that was Texas Tech. 87 rushing yards. The ceiling's much higher for him in this category. 281 yards through the air. Washington's a willing dance partner who hasn't played a good team yet. They've had a good defense on paper, but I hesitate to say they're good after they finished around the top 100 last year and returned most of their starters. This has bit me. I did this with UCLA, so I'm not saying their defense is bad. I'm saying they're unknown. Bo Nix, good play if you can afford him. Bucky Irving, this guy could get a monstrous workload without Noah Whittington. I'm not sure what they do. In competitive games, I think they'll give it to him. He's just one of the most dynamic backs in the country, honestly. Oregon's just had the luxury of having multiple backs that they can rotate in and out, but Whittington's out for the year. My question is, do they put Jordan James in the Whittington role, or do they let Bucky Irving run a little more and see maybe 20 touches a game? Bucky Irving is so efficient that even if he gets around 15 carries with his pass game role, which is elite, I mean, the guy had a 70% route share last week. So, I mean, like, he projects well in his role, but if you give him the boost of having no Whittington and James maybe being a change of pace, man, sky's the limit for Irving. This could be an interesting way to play the game. The receiving room, Troy Franklin's their bona fide number one stud. He's 8,100, so you can see how stacking this game gets tricky immediately. But he's averaging 107 yards per game, 8.4 targets. Play Troy Franklin if you can get there. Beyond him is where things get a little weird for this team, and I think you probably are going to end up, if you're stacking this game, you're probably going to end up with some of the cheap guys. Tez Johnson, I don't know if this was an injury or a benching, but the guy has a season high. This is an individual game. His season high for routes is 54%. That was in week 1. Since then, stayed at 54% in week 2, dropped down to 42, back up to 45, down to 29 last week. That 29% route share coincided with it wasn't a season high, but it was close. For Gary Bryant, 82%. So I think straight up, the second best price adjusted play in the receiving course, Gary Bryant at 5K. Third is Trayshawn Holden. His routes have been pretty consistent. He did jump up to 62%, which was a season high. Still not near the top of the routes for the team, but Holden, it's at least noteworthy. He's the Alabama transfer, 4,600. A good value play, without a doubt. Tight end Terrence Ferguson, routes around 60%. He'll split time with Pat Herbert, Casey Kelly. It's tough to click his name. I'd rather play Holden at his price. For Washington, 112th in pace, but a 60% pass rate, living through efficiency. Penix is averaging 400 yards per game. He hasn't played a good defense yet. Oregon looks like that on paper. So they had a little bit of production allowed to Texas Tech. I still think Penix will produce. But Penix doesn't run, and he's 10.2K. So I'd rather play Bo Nix straight up over Penix. But, I mean, the ceiling is monstrous if he gets you another 400-yard, 4 or 5 score game. We've seen it with Penix. I honestly will probably come in underweight to both of these signal callers because of pricing and look more towards some of the cheaper guys like Emory Jones, Jalen Milroe, whoever it may be. And then stack the game with skinny stacks, whether it's like Bucky Irving to O'Doon, save some salary. Do things like that is my current approach. We'll see if this persists once we get to live before lock. But because we haven't seen a lot of competitive games, we haven't really seen this backfield. I think Dylan Johnson's going to handle most of the work. Last week, he had 16 carries and 5 targets. That's 21 touches for an offense that's incredibly pass heavy. And the route rate for Johnson, man, I'm going to pull it up right now because this was awesome. Dylan Johnson, I think, is a really sneaky running back play on this slate. Routes at 63%. The game prior, he was at 24. And again, Washington hasn't played a lot of competent teams. So we have a willing dance partner on the other side, like Dylan Johnson. When they're seeing competitive games, 5,800, like he maybe is in the cash conversation. Really good play. Like Johnson a lot. The receiving game, play Romo Dunes if you can get him. I mean, the guy's averaging 121.5 yards, 9 targets per game. Locked in stud. And then Jalen McMillan's back. I have questions with McMillan's health. Even prior to the injury, the route share wasn't what we saw last year. 70%, 69%. The third game he got hurt. For reference, Jalen Polk was at 54%, 74%. So that second game, Polk played more than McMillan anyway. And then Jemmy Bernard playing 40% of the routes and 33% of the routes in those games. He just siphons off enough where you don't have Polk or McMillan playing 100% of the routes like you did last year. And since the injury, Jemmy Bernard has actually ascended into a pretty good player for them. 56% of the routes, 68%, and 77%. How does his ascendance affect the rotation of McMillan and Polk? Because he's not affecting O'Dunes, that's a fact. I don't have the answer, but I think it makes them all slightly expensive, with the exception of Bernard. I mean, he had 11 targets last week. Bernard is a good value play. I will be mixing in Polk and McMillan for tournaments just because the upside is enormous. And I mean, one of them could play 90% of the routes. We just don't know. It's a question in a hole that I want you guys to think about as we get to this slate. But I think O'Dunes is by far the safest. Tight ends are rotation. Westover, Culp, Wavas all rotate. I think it's tough to play any of them. I'd rather get to Jeremy Bernard or play like a Trayshawn Holden, a different value play from these teams. A&M Tennessee, a really sneaky game to stack, I think. 3-point spread in favor of the Vols, 55 total. A&M 70th in pace, 52% pass rate. They've really varied their pace. They were much faster under Wegman earlier in the year. And maybe this is to mask some of the turnovers for Johnson. I don't know, but they've slowed a little bit. Still, Tennessee is third in pace with a 47% pass rate. A very willing dance partner, if you will. I've said that a lot, so excuse me. Anyway, Johnson at 6,500. I think he's a pretty good price-adjusted play. He runs a little bit, 49 rush yards, got some Jameis Winston to his game. Passing efficiency, he's a little worse than Wegman, but it's honestly not a huge drop-off. Where you see the drop-off is the turnover-worthy plays, and it's not always interceptions. This guy fumbles. I mean, he's a little erratic. Oftentimes for DFS, that doesn't necessarily hurt you if you create short fields or whatnot for your opponents to score. Then you're immediately in pass-heavy scripts. So I don't hate Johnson. His price is nice in a good game environment. Le'Veon Moss has somewhat iced Reuben Owens and Amari Daniels. He's now seen at least 16 touches in 3 straight games. His pass game role has really come on, too. If you look at his route rate, I mean, Moss is pretty good play this game. You're worried about him being a slight underdog, but I don't have any qualms with playing Moss. Last week, his route share was 68%, so pretty good route share for Le'Veon Moss. Their receiving game, it's Aeneas Smith, Evan Stewart, and tentatively Noah Thomas. Stewart, coming off the injury, was a little worried, but we saw him immediately come back and have a 97% route share. I think Stewart's just fine. He's cheap in this game environment, 7,100. Aeneas Smith at 4,900. Honestly, this is probably the biggest mistake on the slate for DraftKings. It's not egregious, but this his routes have ascended. He's up at 88% last game, 7 targets. He's now averaging 7.3 targets per game in the last 3. So Aeneas Smith, unbelievably good play. Tight end Jake Johnson's played a lot, 74% of the routes in the last game. Really good for him. And then it's been somewhat of a rotation between Moose Muhammad and Noah Thomas for the wide receiver 3. That's a situation I'm probably going to ignore and then just stick to Jake Johnson, who's a good value play at tight end, Evan Stewart, and Aeneas Smith. Tennessee, Joe Milton. It's a run-heavy attack, but Milton's not uninvolved. He doesn't have more than 3 designed attempts in any game, but scrambles somewhat. He has 133 rush yards, so he's not a complete stiff in the pocket, is what I'm trying to say. His passing efficiency's been poor. He's erratic. 32 attempts per game, just 232 yards. Milton's really expensive, so I'm probably paying down, but I think this offense is solid enough where you can play some one-offs. Excuse me. I had some pretty bad fall allergies. We're battling through it, and we'll get there. But excuse me in the meantime. Running back is a 3-way committee. Unless they're slaughtering teams, you're very rarely going to see a guy get 16 carries like Jalen Wright did in their last game. And then Jabari Small and Dylan Sampson will be involved. They're all expensive, and a 3-way committee is tough to play at these prices. Receiving game, unfortunately, we lost Brew McCoy to a devastating injury. Sorry, Brew, prayers up. That puts Squirrel White and Ramel Keaton firmly into play. Squirrel White, I think, is the best play in the offense. $6K for him is just fine. I don't think he should be cheaper than Ramel Keaton. Their routes are both locked in. You're looking at nearly 100% for both guys. Dante Thornton projects to return the Oregon transfer, so I think he probably is the wide receiver 3, but we've seen them do a couple weird things. Use multiple tight ends with McAllen Castles and Jacob Warren. Caleb Webb played a lot in their last game. But Dante Thornton, I think, is the guy they would prefer to use as the wide receiver 3. Just watch this. Something to watch for sure. Thornton's cheap enough at 4,300 where I'll definitely throw that dart. But if you want to pivot, Caleb Webb at his 60% route share in the prior game. Kansas, Oklahoma State, another pretty good game for DFS, 55.5 total. Kansas 121st in pace. I mean, Jalen Daniels is out. Jason Bean is really affordable. He's really efficient as a rusher. They've just been killing teams with Bean. So my biggest question is, can we get enough pressure from Oklahoma State where maybe they need to throw a little bit? Because Jason Bean, I mean, last game, he threw the ball 12 times against UCF. 12 times. He completed 8 of them for 7.5 yards per attempt, but only 91 yards. And then again, they were slaughtering this team so bad, so you didn't get a lot of designed attempts. You only rushed the ball 6 times. Bean is a really good price-adjusted play. He just needs a team to keep their foot on the gas. I mean, otherwise you're going to see full vanilla Kansas, and they're going to run Daniel Highshaw. Their backup running back had 19 carries. Their third-string running back had 13. Dylan McDuffie with 13 carries. The game prior, he had no carries. How? I know John Rice only got hurt in the game, but how inept was UCF in that game? My goodness. Get it together, man. Anyway, if you see I know a lot of you don't want to click Jason Bean because of last week, but man, Oklahoma State pressures him a little bit, and they're only 3-point underdogs. Bean is going to be coaxed into a game, and he's a very fantasy-friendly game with the mobility and the efficient passing. He's been efficient going back to North Texas, and we actually saw him in this role last year. So I have no issues playing Bean. I actually like him. Devin Neal, better days are ahead when they don't kill teams. Like in their most recent competitive games, he iced Daniel Highshaw 17-8 in terms of carries. Neal's still averaging 99 rushing yards per game, and he handles most of the pass game work. He has another 28.2 receiving yards per game. So Neal, very good play still, 6,700. His price is coming down after the UCF beat down. Receiving game, Quentin Skinner, Luke Grimm, Lawrence Arnold, those are your top three. Mason Fairchild, he's the tight end. They're rotating a little more than previous years. You'll see Trevor Wilson, tight end 2, Jared Casey, Trevor Cardell, Douglas Ameline. But I don't think you need to require a stack with Bean. He runs enough where I'm not that worried. It's risky though, man. Maybe you just throw some darts on Skinner, Grimm, and Arnold. I prefer Arnold 1 over these guys. My second would be Grimm, third would be Skinner. But I don't feel good about this, to say the least. They all have the same amount of targets too. Oklahoma State, Alan Bowman, $7K for him. The stats are almost impossible to look at because they've been playing quarterback roulette. But Bowman is not even averaging 6 yards per attempt. I think it's pretty difficult to get to him. He had 8 design carries last game. Like, I need to go back and watch Oklahoma State. How many of these were sneaks? I don't know, but he's only had 12 design carries this year. 8 of them were in the last game. That's very, very weird because he's not mobile. Anyway, just a funny stat I thought was worth mentioning. Bowman would need to be like Hudson Card's price for me to play him. Ollie Gordon's playable at 6.2. The guy is coming off 23 touches and 22 touches in the last 2 games. His route share is 52%. It's been up above 70 since they decided he's their lead back. Just no Jaden Nixon, no Elijah Collins to be seen. Ollie Gordon's a solid play. In the receiving game, Dazon Stribling out for the year. That's allowed Jaden Bray, Brennan Presley, and Rashad Owens to play locked-in roles. Their routes surprised me a little bit. I thought this would be more of a rotation. We knew that Jaden Bray and Brennan Presley were going to be locked-in receivers. But then it was Rashad Owens, 81% of the routes. I did not think it was going to be him. I thought it was going to be Blaine Green or Taylon Shelton, who were both involved around 20% of the routes apiece. But man, Rashad Owens at his price, 7 targets, good play for him for sure. Tight end, I'm weary of Josiah Johnson. Only 29% of the routes last game. Even though he had 5 targets, I'll still pass on him. I'll just play Rashad Owens at 3,500. He is your single best value play on the slate. You need a cheap guy, it's Rashad Owens. Illinois, Maryland, 14-point spread in favor of the Terps, 51.5 total. Both teams are fast. Illinois is 15th in pace, believe it or not. Maryland's 46th. Both teams are pass heavy. Illinois, not by choice. They've been getting clobbered in games, 56% pass rate. Maryland is 54% pass rate. I think this is a sneaky shooter. I won't lie to you. I like stacking this game. Not on the Altmaier side. He's 6,200. He runs a lot. 172 rush yards per game for him. Not efficient as a passer, but the volume's good in this kind of offense. So a rogue Luke Altmaier stack wouldn't surprise me. Very easy to stack, too. You just play Isaiah Williams and feast. 9.5 targets per game, 84 yards per game. Casey Washington's playing well ahead of Pat Bryant recently as the wide receiver, too. Neither's been efficient, so I don't want to play those guys. The backfield, Reggie Love is hurt, and Josh McCray is hurt. That's leading us to Caden Fagan. I think it's how you say his name. Fegan? I don't know. Caden Fegan. Caden F, we'll call him. But anyway, they don't have anybody else. Like the next back on their team, Aiden Lawfrey, has 3 carries. Caden Fegan has 24, which isn't awesome. But they don't have anybody else. 4,500. He's your cheap back of choice this week. I would play him over almost anyone else at this price range. And then on the Maryland side, Illinois is allowing 6.7 yards per attempt. They've played some inept Big Ten schools and then a pretty easy non-con. Maryland's going to pass the ball, 54% pass rate, 46th in pace. Illinois lost 4 DBs to the NFL. I do not believe that they did a good enough job replacing these guys to be wary of this 6.7 mark. I'm going to stack Tagovailoa, who's averaging 278 through the air per game, and he's running a little more than he ever has, 89 cumulative yards. I don't know if that's by design. I guess we can look. Designed attempts of 4, 3, and 5 in their last 3 games. Pretty good for Tagovailoa. Illinois is not going to generate a lot of pressure, and I still don't buy this secondary for them. I'm going to run some Tagovailoa stacks and some Illinois runbacks with Isaiah Williams because of the pace in this game. I think for stacking purposes, this is very clear. They condensed their rotation. Ty Felton, Jay-Sean Jones, Caden Prather were out there almost every snap at the expense of Octavian Smith, Ty Chambers, Shalik Knotts. These guys were all benched. We can use Prather, Jay-Sean Jones, and Ty Felton with confidence now. Corey Dykes, I'm not quite as confident in because they will use 4 tight ends. But man, really good price on these guys. For whatever reason, DraftKings still prices Roman Hemby as if he's a lead back. He didn't even lead the team in carries last week. I know it was a blowout, but they use Antwain Littleton and Colby McDonald. So Hemby needs to be cheaper if I'm going to click his name. Iowa, Wisconsin. 9.5 point spread, 33.5 total. This is down to 33 since I uploaded this. I don't know what Deacon Hill looks like, but it's not a quarterback. He didn't even complete a pass to a receiver last week. He has a sub 40% completion and he can't run. He should be the rebate play on DraftKings where if you roster him, you get extra salary to play Marvin Harrison and whatever stud O'Dunes. If you roster Deacon Hill, you can stack anyone you want in Washington, Oregon. That's not how the game is played, but it's how it should be played. Do not play Deacon Hill. Do not play an Iowa running back. It's a committee between Caleb Johnson, LaShawn Williams, and whatever you do, please do not play an Iowa receiver, no matter how well they project. Maybe you could play Eric All. I wouldn't even recommend that. Wisconsin. Also, I didn't even mention this. The total is so low, not just because of Iowa. This game is going to be in a monsoon. So Tanner Mordecai is probably not a good play. 32 attempts per game. I don't think he sees that. He runs a little bit. They actually used him on 7 designed run attempts last game and 10 the game prior. But I don't think they want to do that in a monsoon either. Expect to see a ton of Braylon Allen and change of pace Jackson Acker. Braylon Allen, 21 carries, still handling all the pass game work. He had only 2 targets last week, and man, I had an over on his prop, 13.5 yards. He got to 14, barely got there, but 55% route share. They're not going to pass a ton in this game, but Allen, if they do, is involved. He's 8,300, but for a pay-up contrarian back, he's definitely my favorite in this game environment. He's just going to see a million carries. And then Jackson Acker, they had no hesitance with him. 13 carries right out the gate. Didn't really have a ton of involvement in the pass game, but 2 targets still. Acker, as a 4K punt option, you could do worse. And then I do not think I'll play a Wisconsin receiver in this game. Even though they're cheap, I am afraid of this weather. I live in Wisconsin. It has been raining for 24 hours already, and I have seen the forecast. It is not pretty. I am an hour away from Madison. I'm not a weatherman, though, so take this for what it's worth. All right, well, actually, that does it. We're on to the night slate, so I will bring us back. I also forgot to mention, I always do this. If you want access to this stuff, we have a package at Stochastic. You can click the link in the video description below. It gives you projections, ownership projections. This tool is on there, so you don't have to pause the video and just watch it or just like take notes on it, whatever you guys do. I don't know. But this is available to you. So link in the video description below for all that. It's also a package I put together myself and put a lot of work into it. So if you want to support, that's the best way to do so. Thank you if you already do have it. Before we go, I'll give you the top plays at each position as we've been doing over the last couple videos. We'll start with quarterback. And man, this is really hard for me. I think in cash, you probably want one of Bo Nix or Penix. I prefer Bo Nix right now because of the rushing equity, but just know these guys aren't going to project super well when you price adjust their 10K, but the upside is still enormous. I think you want one of them. For tournaments, I like guys like Milroe and Travis, players with big upside, rushing ability, semi-blowout games, but if they're kept competitive enough, you can use these players in stacks. If you're playing it safe, I think the safest options for cash outside of the elite guys are going to be Jason Bean, needs to be pushed a little bit by Oklahoma State, but has really good dual threat ability if he is. Emory Jones, same thing with him. The big worry is the game environment. Like Emory Jones, otherwise good rushing ability. The offense is very fast. And then for your punt options, I'm very interested in Max Johnson. I'm not going to say Hudson Card. I'm not going to do it. I'll say Max Johnson's the preferred punt option for me. At running back, a lot of good plays. We mentioned Caden Fagan for Illinois. He's the cheap guy you'd look to. But otherwise, the top price adjusted guys, Dylan Johnson for Washington. This is somewhat volatile because they haven't been pushed a lot. But in their last game, 21 touches for Johnson in a pass-heavy offense. That'll definitely play. Ollie Gordon, over 20 touches in the last 2 for Oklahoma State. He's facing Kansas. They're projected to keep it relatively close. And third, I'll go with Le'Veon Moss, another player who's just been in an ascending role for Texas A&M. All that to complement Caden Fagan if you need a really cheap guy. For payups, I like Bucky Irving and I like Braylon Allen. Game environment's risky for Allen, but I don't know if they pass at all. Wide receiver. Sorry, I'll scroll down to my rankings. All right, so no surprise, Rashad Owens is the top price-adjusted play on the slate by a wide margin at 3,500. 80% of the routes for him. Playing Kansas doesn't really scare you, 55 total. Number 2 is Ainias Smith at 49. We kind of thought this would be the case. He has an 85+% route share last 2 games. Very involved. No issues with Ainias Smith. Isaiah Williams is 3rd. This was a bit of a surprise for me, but he's 5,500. We know he projects well. He has over 10 targets in 3 of the last 4 games. No problem with Williams. 4 is Caden Prather. And honestly, so 4 of the top 7 are Maryland receivers. So Prather, Jayshon Jones, and Ty Felton. If you extend this down like to our top 7, they're all in there. And I think this is just an error in pricing after Maryland, for whatever reason, condensed their route shares. So Prather, Jones, and Ty Felton are all in this range. And lastly, last guy I'll mention, the best pay-up option at receiver is actually Brock Bowers. This is requiring definitely teams to push him. I think I would rather play Troy Franklin or O'Dunes over Bowers straight up, but at least he projects well in a non-blowout game, I should say. But that'll do it for us. Let me know in the comments what you think of the video. If I missed anything, I would love to hear it. Otherwise, we'll be back next week talking more DFS, and we'll be on Live Before Lock tomorrow, an hour before kickoff, myself and Ben Ross on this very channel. If you have a question, reach out on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Otherwise, we'll see you guys next time, and good luck.